The quietest man in a saloon is sometimes the one everyone should fear, the old rancher liked to say, though on that hot afternoon in Red Hollow nobody seemed to remember those words. Dust drifted through the open doors of the Broken Spur Saloon, carried by a dry desert wind that had rolled across miles of cracked earth and sunburned hills before slipping into the room like an uninvited guest. The place smelled of leather, oak barrels, and the faint sweetness of whiskey poured too many times to count. Behind the bar stood Elias Carter, a man most folks barely noticed even after seeing him every day. He moved slowly, methodically, polishing a glass with a worn white cloth, the kind of quiet motion that made people forget he was even there. Elias looked ordinary by every measure that mattered in a town like Red Hollow. His shirt was plain, sleeves rolled just above the elbows, and his boots were dusty from the walk he took every morning from a small cabin half a mile outside town. His hair carried a few streaks of gray, though no one could quite guess his age, and his eyes rarely lingered on anyone long enough to invite conversation. To the people who stopped by the saloon after long rides or harder days, Elias was simply the bartender who kept the whiskey flowing and the trouble outside the door. The afternoon had been calm until the sound arrived first, the distant rhythm of hooves striking packed dirt somewhere beyond the wooden boardwalks. The regulars inside the saloon didn't need to look outside to know who it might be. In towns like Red Hollow, certain riders announced themselves long before they appeared in the doorway. A few men at the card table exchanged glances. Someone muttered something under his breath. The piano players stopped mid-note, letting the last sound fade into the dry air. Then the doors swung open with a hard push, sunlight spilling across the floorboards as four riders stepped inside, bringing with them the smell of dust and a confidence that filled the room before they even spoke. At the center of them stood Wade Dalton, tall, sharp-eyed, wearing the kind of crooked smile that told everyone he expected the world to move out of his way. Dalton's boots tapped slowly across the wooden floor, each step echoing through the saloon as if the building itself were paying attention. His men spread out casually, leaning against posts and tables, their laughter low and careless. Dalton's eyes drifted across the room until they settled on the man behind the bar. Elias Carter didn't look up right away. He simply finished wiping the glass in his hand and placed it carefully beside the others. Dalton leaned forward on the counter, glancing at the neat rows of bottles as if the place belonged to him. "Well now," he said with a lazy grin, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Looks like Red Hollow hired itself the quietest bartender west of the Mississippi." A few of the outlaws chuckled, the sound bouncing off the walls. Elias finally lifted his eyes, calm and steady, and nodded once. "What can I get you?" he asked quietly. Dalton laughed as if the question itself were the funniest thing he'd heard all week. None of the men in the room knew it yet, but in the slow silence that followed, something had already shifted in the air, like the moment before a desert storm breaks across the horizon. The laughter from Dalton and his men rolled across the saloon like loose gravel sliding down a dry hill, loud enough to make the men at the card table shift in their chairs and pretend they were more interested in their hands than the trouble standing 10 feet away. Wade Dalton rested both palms on the bar, leaning forward as if he were studying something curious, his eyes moving slowly across the shelves behind Elias Carter. Bottles of rye and bourbon caught the sunlight coming through the window, their amber color glowing like desert honey. Dalton picked up a bottle without asking and turned it in his hand, reading the label with exaggerated care before setting it back down again. "You run this place alone?" he asked, his tone casual but carrying the weight of someone used to being answered. Elias Carter stood exactly where he had been a moment earlier, the same quiet bartender most people in Red Hollow believed they understood. He reached beneath the counter and placed a clean glass in front of Dalton, then poured 2 fingers of whiskey with the steady hand of a man who had done the same motion thousands of times. "Most days," Elias said calmly. The words were simple, but they did not invite conversation. Dalton lifted the glass, sniffed the whiskey, and took a slow sip as if he were judging a contest nobody else had entered. Behind him, one of his men dragged a chair across the floorboards and sat down backward in it, resting his arms on the backrest while watching the room. Another leaned against a wooden post near the door, spinning a silver coin between his fingers. Their presence filled the saloon like a storm cloud that had drifted too close to town. The piano player still had not touched the keys again. Dalton placed the glass down with a soft clink and studied Elias more carefully now. "You do not say much, do you?" he said, tilting his head slightly. Elias wiped the bar with a folded cloth, moving from left to right in an unhurried line. "Talking does not pour whiskey any faster," he replied. A few quiet chuckles slipped from Dalton's men, though they sounded more surprised than amused. Dalton's smile widened, the crooked kind that made people in Red Hollow uneasy even when he was joking. "Well now," he said, glancing around the room. "I have met bartenders who like to talk all day. Stories about cattle drives, poker games, storms rolling in from New Mexico. But you look like a man who keeps his stories locked up." Elias did not answer right away. Outside, a gust of wind pushed dust along the boardwalk, rattling the loose sign above the saloon door. The sound carried through the room like a whisper. Finally, Elias set the cloth down and replaced the bottle behind the counter. "Most stories are not worth the telling," he said quietly. Dalton laughed again, louder this time, and turned to his men as if he had just discovered something entertaining. "Did you hear that?" he said. "Our bartender here believes stories are not worth telling." The outlaw with the silver coin flicked it into the air and caught it again. "Maybe he does not have any good ones," he said. The men laughed, the sound bouncing off the walls and rolling across the tables. But in the corner of the saloon, an older rancher who had been nursing a cup of coffee all afternoon finally lifted his head. His eyes moved slowly toward Elias Carter, studying the quiet man behind the bar with the careful attention of someone remembering something important. He did not laugh with the others. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and watched, as if he had seen a moment like this once before and knew how such moments could end. The laughter slowly faded, but the feeling it left behind stayed in the air like dust that refused to settle. Wade Dalton leaned one elbow on the counter as though he had all the time in the world, his glass resting loosely in his hand, while his eyes kept drifting back to the quiet man behind the bar. Elias Carter had already returned to his work, polishing another glass with the same careful rhythm, the cloth moving in slow circles that seemed almost hypnotic. To anyone passing through Red Hollow for the first time, Elias looked exactly like the kind of bartender every small western town had, the kind who listened more than he spoke and never stepped into trouble that did not belong to him. But the people who had lived in Red Hollow long enough knew something about him that was harder to explain. Elias had arrived in town nearly 3 years earlier, walking in from the eastern road just before winter set in. He had not brought much with him, only a weathered saddlebag, a bedroll tied behind it, and a quiet way of carrying himself that made people curious without giving them anything to ask about. The owner of the Broken Spur Saloon at the time had been an old woman named Martha Hensley, who believed a man's character showed itself in how he worked when nobody was watching. Elias had spent his first week sweeping the floor, repairing a broken hinge on the back door, and helping unload supply wagons that rolled through town every month from Amarillo. He had never asked for more than a simple meal and a place to sleep in the storage room upstairs. By the end of that winter, Martha had handed him the keys to the bar and told the town that Elias Carter would be running the place from then on. Nobody argued with her decision. Since then, Elias had become part of the quiet rhythm of Red Hollow. Every morning before sunrise, he walked half a mile from his small cabin outside town, the same path worn into the dry grass by his boots. He opened the saloon doors at exactly 7 o'clock, swept the floorboards, wiped down the bar, and set the first row of glasses in the sunlight that spilled through the east window. By noon, the ranch hands arrived for coffee and stories. By evening, the cattle drivers stopped in for whiskey and card games that lasted until the lamps burned low. Through all of it, Elias remained the same calm presence behind the counter, never raising his voice, never rushing a drink, never stepping into arguments that sometimes drifted across the tables like summer thunderheads. That quiet consistency made people trust him, but it also made most of them overlook something important. There were small details that did not quite match the picture of a simple bartender. The way Elias moved carried a balance that came from long miles in the saddle. The faint lines on his hands looked less like the marks of glassware and more like the kind earned from years of handling leather and steel. Once in a while, someone would notice how his eyes followed the doorway whenever strangers entered, not with fear, but with the careful attention of a man who liked to understand a room before the room understood him. Most people ignored those details. Life in a frontier town offered enough worries without searching for hidden stories in a quiet bartender. But the old rancher sitting in the corner had not ignored them. He had been watching Elias Carter for nearly a year now, ever since a cold morning when he had seen the bartender step outside the saloon and pause in the street while adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. It had been a small movement, quick and ordinary to anyone else, yet the rancher had recognized the ease of it instantly. That kind of movement belonged to a man who had once lived by timing and precision, the kind that could decide the difference between calm and chaos in the blink of an eye. The rancher said nothing about what he suspected. In towns like Red Hollow, a man's past often stayed buried unless it chose the wrong moment to stand up again. And as Wade Dalton and his men continued laughing near the bar, the rancher had the uneasy feeling that such a moment might already be walking through the door. The uneasy quiet that settled over the saloon did not last long. Wade Dalton finished the whiskey in his glass and set it down with a deliberate tap on the wooden counter, the sound sharp enough to pull every pair of eyes back toward the bar. His crooked smile returned as if the entire room existed only to entertain him. "You pour a decent drink," he said slowly, turning the empty glass in a small circle with his fingers. "But a place like this should have a little more spirit to it." One of his men laughed and leaned back in his chair, boots stretched out across the floorboards. Another tipped his hat toward the bartender with exaggerated politeness. The silver coin continued to spin between the fingers of the third man, flashing in the lamplight like a tiny piece of sunlight. Elias Carter did not react to the performance. He picked up the empty glass, rinsed it with a splash of water from a tin pitcher, and began polishing it again with the same steady rhythm he had used all afternoon. The cloth moved in slow circles, calm, unhurried. Dalton watched him with the amused patience of a man studying an unusual animal. "You know," Dalton said, glancing over his shoulder at the room, "most towns we ride through have bartenders who know how to keep customers entertained." He looked back at Elias. Stories, jokes, maybe a little music. His eyes drifted toward the silent piano. "But this place feels quiet enough to hear a lizard crawl across the desert." A few uneasy chuckles came from Dalton's men, though none of the townsfolk joined them. The rancher in the corner shifted slightly in his chair, still watching Elias with the careful focus of someone waiting for a signal that had not yet arrived. Dalton drummed his fingers on the counter, then leaned forward again. "Tell me something, bartender," he said. "Do you ever get bored standing in one spot all day?" Elias placed the glass back on the shelf behind him. "Work keeps a man busy," he replied calmly. Dalton tilted his head, studying him as if the answer had not been quite what he expected. "Maybe," he said. "But sometimes a man needs to stretch his legs." His hand moved across the counter, nudging a small stack of empty glasses closer to the edge. They clinked softly together, the sound echoing across the quiet room. "Or maybe show a little life." One of the outlaws leaned forward eagerly. "Yeah," he said with a grin. "Let us see if the quiet bartender can move faster than he talks." The coin spinner flicked his silver piece high into the air and caught it again with a snap of his palm. Dalton chuckled and gestured toward Elias as though introducing him to an audience. "Come on now," he said, his voice carrying across the saloon. "A man who stands that calm in a room like this must have something interesting hidden away." Elias did not raise his voice or change his expression. He simply continued wiping the counter, the cloth sliding across the polished wood as smooth as wind over dry grass. Yet for the first time since Dalton had walked in, the bartender's eyes lifted slightly and moved across the room, taking in the tables, the doorway, the shadows near the walls. It was a small movement. Most of the men in the saloon did not notice it, but the rancher in the corner did. And as he watched the quiet bartender look around the room with that slow, measuring calm, the old man felt a familiar chill run along the back of his neck. It was the same feeling he used to get years ago on the open range, just before a sudden desert storm rolled over the horizon. The room held its breath in a strange, stretched silence that made every small sound feel louder than it should have been. Outside, the wind slid along the wooden boardwalk and carried a thin ribbon of dust past the saloon doors. Inside, Wade Dalton leaned casually against the bar as if the entire town belonged to him, his crooked smile returning while his eyes stayed fixed on the quiet man behind the counter. One of his men flipped the silver coin again, letting it spin across his knuckles before catching it in his palm. The soft click echoed across the room like a ticking clock. Dalton glanced toward the piano, still untouched, then back to Elias Carter. "You know," he said slowly, his voice relaxed but sharp enough to cut through the silence. "This place could use a little entertainment." His men chuckled, shifting their boots against the floorboards. The bartender remained calm. Elias slid another glass onto the shelf behind him and straightened the row beside it with quiet precision. Every motion looked ordinary, almost dull, the kind of slow work that made most people lose interest after a moment. Dalton watched him carefully now, the amusement in his expression turning into curiosity. "Do you ever hurry, bartender?" Dalton asked. "Or is slow the only speed you know?" The question floated across the saloon. A ranch hand near the back lowered his eyes to the table. Nobody wanted to be part of the conversation. Elias picked up the cloth again and wiped a faint ring of moisture from the counter. "Fast work usually means careless work," he said calmly. Dalton laughed at that, throwing his head back slightly. "Hear that?" he called to his men. "The quiet one thinks slow is better." The outlaw with the coin grinned and leaned forward on his elbows. "Maybe we should test that," he said. Dalton's eyes brightened. He lifted his glass and tipped the last drop onto the wooden counter in front of Elias. The amber liquid spread slowly across the polished surface. "Clean that up," Dalton said lightly. Elias reached for the cloth without a word and began wiping the spill away. Dalton watched closely, as if studying the bartender's hands. "You move careful," he said after a moment. "Too careful." The silver coin flicked into the air again. This time it landed on the counter and spun in a small circle before falling flat. Dalton leaned closer to Elias, lowering his voice just enough to make the room lean in with him. "Tell me something," he said. "A man who moves that steady must have learned it somewhere." Elias finished wiping the counter and folded the cloth neatly in his hands. His expression remained calm, but the rancher in the corner noticed something most others missed. For a single moment the bartender's eyes sharpened, the way a hawk's eyes change when it spots movement far below the sky. It lasted less than a second. Then the quiet returned to his face. "Everyone learns patience eventually," Elias said. Dalton stared at him, then leaned back with a small laugh as if he had just heard the most amusing answer in the world. His men laughed with him, but the sound felt forced now, like men trying to fill a silence they did not understand. The rancher slowly lifted his cup of coffee and took a sip without looking away from the bar. He had heard men talk like Dalton before. Loud voices, easy confidence, the kind that filled a room quickly but rarely lasted long. But he had also seen the other kind of man, the quiet kind. The kind who moved slow because he already knew exactly how fast the world could change when the moment came. The laughter that followed Dalton's last remark faded slower this time, stretching thin across the saloon like smoke that refused to clear. No one else in the room joined it. The men at the card table stared down at their hands without turning a single card. The piano player sat frozen on the stool, fingers resting above the keys but never touching them. Even the wind outside seemed to pause as if the desert itself were waiting to see what would happen next. Wade Dalton noticed the silence, but did not seem bothered by it. If anything, the quiet only sharpened the amusement in his eyes. He leaned his elbows on the counter and studied Elias Carter with the relaxed patience of a man who believed every room eventually bent to his mood. One of his men shifted his boots across the floorboards and gave a small chuckle, though the sound felt uncertain now. The silver coin flicked upward again, caught midair, then disappeared back into the outlaw's palm. Dalton tilted his head slightly and spoke again, his voice smooth and almost friendly. "You know something, bartender," he said. "Most men in towns like this get nervous when strangers walk in wearing dust from 100 miles of open trail." His gaze moved slowly across the room before returning to Elias. "But you barely blink." Elias rested both hands on the wooden counter and looked at Dalton with the same steady calm he had carried all afternoon. The lamplight reflected faintly in his eyes, though there was no hurry in his movements and no challenge in his voice when he answered. "A saloon sees many travelers," he said quietly. "Dust does not surprise anyone out here." Dalton smiled wider, though the smile had changed slightly. There was curiosity in it now, the kind that appears when a man expects to see fear but finds something else instead. He straightened up and pushed away from the bar, pacing slowly across the floorboards as if stretching his legs after a long ride. His boots made dull, thuds with every step. Maybe, Dalton said, glancing back toward the bartender. But sometimes strangers bring more than dust. He stopped beside one of the tables and rested his hand on the back of a chair. The men sitting there quickly stood and moved aside without a word. Dalton chuckled softly and looked over his shoulder at Elias again. Still, he said, I admire a man who keeps his composure. The word lingered in the air. Composure. The rancher in the corner quietly set his cup down on the table. His eyes never left Elias Carter. He had been listening carefully to every word spoken in the room. But more importantly, he had been watching the spaces between those words. The quiet pauses. The way Elias never rushed to answer. The way his shoulders remained loose even while Dalton and his men filled the saloon with their presence. The rancher had spent enough years on the open range to recognize a certain kind of calm. It was not the calm of a man who did not notice danger. It was the calm of someone who had already measured it. Dalton turned back toward the bar and walked slowly until he stood directly across from Elias again. For a moment he said nothing at all. His eyes drifted down toward the bartender's hands resting on the counter. They were steady hands. Strong hands. The kind that had spent years doing more than wiping glasses. Dalton's smile returned, though this time it carried a different tone. Tell me something, bartender, he said quietly. Have you always been this calm, or did you learn it somewhere along the road? Elias Carter looked at him without blinking. And for the briefest moment, the room felt even quieter than before, as if every man inside the saloon had just stepped closer to a story that had not yet revealed its ending. The silence after Dalton's question hung over the saloon like the still air before a summer thunderstorm rolling across the plains. For a long moment, no one moved. The lamps flickered gently against the wooden walls, and outside the dry wind brushed dust along the boardwalk with a quiet scraping sound. Elias Carter stood behind the bar exactly as he had all afternoon, hands resting lightly on the counter, eyes steady on the man across from him. His expression did not change, but something in the room shifted all the same, the way a herd of cattle senses a storm hours before the clouds appear. Wade Dalton watched him closely now, his crooked smile fading into something more thoughtful. The amusement was still there, but curiosity had taken a stronger hold. Dalton had spent years riding across open country and passing through towns that all looked the same after a while. He had seen frightened sheriffs, nervous ranchers, and bartenders who hurried to refill glasses whenever trouble walked through the door. But the man standing in front of him did not hurry. That was what caught Dalton's attention more than anything else. You did not answer my question, Dalton said after a moment, his voice calm, but firm enough to carry through the room. Elias reached for the cloth resting beside the bottles and wiped a faint line of dust from the edge of the bar. His movements were slow and careful, the same steady rhythm he had shown since the moment Dalton and his men had walked inside. I learned it the same way most men do, Elias said quietly, by living long enough to understand that rushing rarely improves anything. Dalton let out a soft laugh, though the sound did not spread to the rest of the room. His men shifted slightly where they stood, but none of them spoke. Even the outlaw with the silver coin had stopped flipping it. The coin rested still in his palm now, forgotten. Dalton leaned forward again, resting both hands on the counter as he studied the bartender with renewed interest. That sounds like the kind of wisdom a man picks up after a long road, Dalton said. A very long road. Elias did not argue. He simply set the cloth aside and adjusted the row of glasses behind him, aligning them so that each one caught the same sliver of lamplight. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the faint clink of glass touching wood. In the corner, the old rancher slowly shifted in his chair again. His eyes followed every movement Elias made, not with suspicion, but with the quiet recognition of someone watching a familiar pattern unfold. The rancher had seen many men over the years, and he knew the difference between calm that came from ignorance and calm that came from experience. Elias Carter carried the second kind. Dalton tapped the counter with one finger, breaking the silence once more. You know, he said, glancing toward the doorway and then back to Elias. Some men spend their lives trying to look tough. Others spend their lives proving it. But every once in a while you meet a man who does not seem interested in either. He tilted his head slightly, and that makes a fellow curious. Elias finally looked up fully now, meeting Dalton's gaze without tension, without challenge, simply with the quiet steadiness he had shown since the beginning. Curiosity can be useful, Elias said calmly, as long as a man knows when to stop asking questions. Dalton's smile returned slowly, though it carried less laughter than before. The room had grown so quiet that every man inside could hear the faint creak of the saloon sign outside swaying in the wind. And in that quiet moment, more than one person in the room began to wonder whether the quiet bartender behind the counter might be carrying a story far larger than anyone in Red Hollow had ever guessed. Wade Dalton did not answer right away after Elias spoke. The outlaw simply stood there with both hands resting on the bar, studying the quiet bartender as though the man had just revealed a puzzle worth solving. Around them, the saloon remained frozen in the same uneasy stillness. The men at the card table had not touched their cards in several minutes. The piano player still sat motionless on the stool. Even the outlaw who liked to spin the silver coin had stopped playing with it, the coin now resting flat beneath his fingers as he watched the exchange with growing curiosity. Dalton finally leaned back and let out a soft laugh that rolled slowly through the room. "That is an interesting answer," he said. "Most men around here are eager to talk when someone asks about their past." His eyes narrowed slightly as he tilted his head toward Elias. "But you seem to prefer keeping yours quiet." Elias did not react. He simply lifted another glass and wiped it carefully with the same worn cloth. The movement was slow, patient, almost peaceful. Dalton watched the glass turn in the bartender's hands and then glanced toward his men. "Maybe the quiet ones are hiding the best stories," he said. One of the outlaws chuckled and shifted his chair back a few inches. Another crossed his arms and leaned against the wooden post near the door. None of them seemed quite as confident as when they had first walked in. Something about the room had changed, though none of them could quite name it. Dalton stepped closer to the bar again, lowering his voice slightly, as if sharing a secret meant only for Elias. "Tell me something else," he said. "Have you ever been in a situation where a man had to move very quickly?" The question drifted through the saloon like a pebble dropped into still water. The rancher in the corner slowly straightened in his chair. He did not look surprised by the question. In fact, he had been waiting for it ever since Dalton first began watching the bartender's hands. Elias set the glass down beside the others and rested both palms lightly on the counter. "Every man has moments when he must act," he said calmly. Dalton smiled again, though this time the smile was smaller and sharper. "Yes," he said quietly. "That is exactly what I was thinking." For a moment he said nothing else. His eyes drifted down toward the bartender's hands again, then across the polished counter, then toward the empty stretch of floor between them. The silence stretched long enough that the faint creak of the saloon sign outside could be heard through the doorway. Finally, Dalton reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small silver coin of his own. He placed it carefully on the counter and pushed it forward until it rested halfway between them. "Let us try a small test," Dalton said lightly. "Nothing serious." His men leaned forward slightly where they stood. Even the card players at the table lifted their eyes now. Dalton tapped the coin once with his finger. "When I say go," he said, "you grab the coin. If you can take it before I do, the next round of whiskey is on me." The offer sounded playful, but the room knew it was not a game. The rancher in the corner slowly shook his head under his breath. He had seen challenges like this before on the frontier. Sometimes they ended in laughter. Sometimes they revealed something far more interesting. Elias Carter looked down at the coin resting on the counter. The silver surface reflected a thin line of lamplight across the wood. For several seconds he did not move at all. Then he lifted his eyes and looked at Dalton again. His voice remained calm, steady, almost gentle when he finally spoke. "Are you sure that is a game you want to play?" And for the first time since entering the saloon, Wade Dalton hesitated just long enough for the men in the room to notice. Wade Dalton's hesitation lasted only a heartbeat, but in a quiet room, even a heartbeat can sound loud. His crooked smile returned quickly, though it looked slightly different now, thinner at the edges, as if he had suddenly realized the game might not be as simple as he first imagined. Around them, the saloon remained still. Every man in the room was watching the small silver coin resting between the two men like it had become the center of the world. Dalton tapped the coin again with the tip of his finger and let out a soft laugh. "It is only a coin," he said. "You grab it faster than me, and I buy the whiskey. Nothing more than that." His men chuckled behind him, though their laughter carried less certainty than before. The outlaw who usually spun a coin in his fingers now watched closely, his own silver piece forgotten on the table beside him. Elias Carter did not move. His hands rested lightly on the wooden counter, fingers relaxed, shoulders loose, his calm presence unchanged by the attention filling the room. The coin reflected a thin line of lamplight that stretched across the bar like a small silver road. For a moment, the only sound inside the saloon was the wind brushing against the outside wall and the faint creak of the hanging sign above the door. Dalton leaned forward slightly and lowered his voice. "Unless," he added with a quiet grin, "you are worried you might lose." A few of the outlaws chuckled again, though none of the townsfolk joined them. The rancher in the corner slowly folded his arms across his chest, his eyes never leaving the bartender. He had seen men bait each other like this before on cattle drives and dusty frontier streets. But he had also learned that the quietest man in the room often knew more about the outcome than anyone else present. Elias finally lowered his gaze to the coin. The polished surface shimmered faintly under the lamplight. For a long moment, he studied it without speaking. Then he lifted his eyes back toward Dalton. "You said when you say go," Elias replied calmly. Dalton nodded once. "That is right." Elias tilted his head slightly, as if considering the arrangement. "And if you take the coin first?" Dalton smiled wider. "Then you pour another drink and admit I am faster." The room held its breath again. The card players had pushed their chairs back slightly without even realizing it. The piano player leaned forward on the stool, elbows resting on his knees. Every eye remained fixed on the bar. Dalton straightened his shoulders and hovered one hand above the coin, fingers ready, the playful challenge still hanging in the air. Elias Carter remained exactly where he stood. Calm. Still. His hands rested on the counter with no sign of urgency at all. But the rancher in the corner noticed something again that others missed. The bartender's posture had changed just enough to reveal balance, the quiet readiness of a man who understood timing better than most people understood breathing. Dalton inhaled slowly and lifted his hand an inch higher above the coin. "All right," he said softly. "Ready?" The word drifted across the room like the first drop of rain before a storm. The coin sat between them, unmoving, catching the lamplight while every man in the saloon waited for the single moment that would reveal far more than a simple game. For several seconds, nothing moved inside the Broken Spur Saloon. The silver coin rested on the wooden counter, catching the lamplight, while two men stood across from each other with the stillness of statues. Wade Dalton held his hand just above the coin, fingers ready, his confident smile returning as if the moment already belonged to him. Around the room, every eye stayed fixed on the bar. Even the wind outside seemed to soften against the walls as though the desert itself had decided to watch. Dalton took a slow breath and said the word at last. "Go." What happened next was so quick that many men in the room would later argue about it for weeks, each one insisting he had seen something different. The rancher in the corner leaned forward slightly, the only man who had expected the moment to move faster than anyone else could follow. Dalton's hand dropped toward the coin with the confidence of a man who had played games like this in dozens of frontier towns. But before his fingers even reached the silver surface, the coin was already gone. A faint sound of metal sliding across would echoed softly across the counter. Dalton's hand closed on empty air. For a heartbeat, he simply froze there, staring at the bare spot where the coin had been. Then he looked up. Elias Carter was still standing behind the bar exactly where he had been before. Calm, unmoved. His posture had not shifted, his shoulders remained loose, and his expression carried the same quiet patience he had shown all afternoon. Only one small detail had changed. The silver coin now rested lightly between two of his fingers. The room stayed silent. One of Dalton's men blinked as if trying to replay the moment in his mind. Another leaned forward slowly, eyes narrowing in disbelief. The outlaw who liked to spin coins lifted his own silver piece from the table and turned it between his fingers with sudden respect. Dalton straightened slowly, the confident grin fading from his face. He glanced down at the empty spot on the bar again, then back to the coin resting in Elias Carter's hand. For the first time since he had walked through the saloon doors, Wade Dalton looked genuinely surprised. "That was quick," he said quietly. Elias did not show pride or amusement. He simply placed the coin back on the counter in front of Dalton as calmly as if he were setting down a glass. "You said the next round would be yours," Elias replied. Dalton stared at the coin for another moment before letting out a short breath that sounded half like laughter and half like realization. Behind him, His men exchanged glances that carried a new kind of attention. The rancher in the corner slowly leaned back into his chair, the faintest smile touching the edge of his mouth. He had seen the movement clearly. Not the coin itself, but the timing of it. The balance. The certainty. Those were the signs he remembered from years long past on dusty trails and frontier streets. Dalton picked up the coin and rolled it across his knuckles once before catching it in his palm. "Well now," he said slowly, his voice quieter than before. "Looks like the quiet bartender has quicker hands than most." Elias Carter returned to polishing a glass as if nothing unusual had happened. But in the silent space that followed, more than one man inside the saloon began to wonder just how many other things the quiet bartender of Red Hollow had been keeping to himself all these years. For a moment after the coin returned to the counter, nobody in the Broken Spur Saloon seemed quite sure what to say. The silence felt different now. Not tense like before, but thoughtful, the kind that settles over a room when something unexpected has just happened and every man inside is trying to decide what it means. Wade Dalton rolled the coin slowly across his knuckles again, though this time the motion lacked the careless confidence he had shown earlier. His eyes drifted back toward Elias Carter, who had already returned to polishing another glass behind the bar with the same patient rhythm as if the small contest had never happened. The faint scrape of cloth against glass echoed softly in the quiet room. Dalton studied him for several seconds before letting out a low chuckle. "Well now," he said, glancing back at his men. "Looks like the bartender wins the first round." One of the outlaws shifted his boots and leaned forward with new curiosity. Another tilted his hat back slightly, watching Elias with a look that carried more respect than mockery now. The man who liked spinning coins flipped his own silver piece into the air again, but this time he caught it slowly and tucked it into his pocket without showing it off. Dalton picked up the coin from the counter and placed it back in his coat. Then he rested both hands on the bar once more and looked at Elias in a different way than before. Not like a man examining a joke, but like someone trying to understand a story he had just realized might be larger than it first appeared. "You move like a man who has practiced that before," Dalton said quietly. Elias placed the clean glass beside the others and straightened the row with careful precision. "Practice makes most things smoother," he replied. Dalton smiled again, though the smile carried less amusement and more interest now. "That kind of speed does not usually come from pouring drinks," he said. The words drifted through the room slowly. Several of the townsfolk glanced at each other, the same question forming in their minds at the same time. The rancher in the corner finally set his empty coffee cup down and spoke for the first time since the challenge began. His voice was calm, but carried clearly through the room. "Some men learn quick hands long before they learn quiet lives." Every head turned toward him. Dalton raised one eyebrow and looked over his shoulder at the old rancher. "That so?" he asked. The rancher nodded once and leaned back in his chair. "Yes," he said simply. Dalton looked back at Elias again, studying him more carefully than ever. The bartender continued his work as though the conversation had nothing to do with him. Yet the room felt different now, the same way a trail looks different once you realize it leads somewhere unexpected. Dalton slowly exhaled and gave a small shake of his head. "You know," he said at last, "I have ridden across a lot of country. I have met fast hands in places from Texas to the Dakota Territory." His eyes narrowed slightly as he looked at Elias. "But I cannot recall meeting a bartender who moves quite like that." Elias finally paused his polishing and looked up at him again, calm and steady as before. For a brief moment the two men simply watched each other across the bar. Then Elias spoke in the same quiet tone he had used all afternoon. "People change roads sometimes," he said. The rancher in the corner allowed himself the faintest smile, because in that single sentence he heard the echo of a much older story, one that had once traveled across the frontier like wildfire carried by dry wind. Wade Dalton remained standing at the bar for several seconds after Elias spoke those quiet words about changing roads. The sentence was simple, yet it carried the kind of weight that made a room pause and think. Dalton studied the bartender carefully now, his earlier amusement replaced by something more thoughtful. Around the saloon the tension that had filled the air earlier slowly began to loosen, though no one fully relaxed. Moments like this on the frontier often meant that something larger had just revealed itself. Dalton finally leaned back from the bar and let out a slow breath. "Well," he said, glancing at his men, I suppose a bet is a bet. He reached for a bottle of whiskey sitting near the edge of the counter and slid it toward Elias with a faint grin. Looks like this round is on me. One of his men laughed quietly, though the sound carried a different tone now. Not mocking. Curious. The man who liked spinning coins lifted his hat slightly toward the bartender. That was a clean move, he admitted. The other outlaws nodded in agreement, their earlier arrogance softened by the small, but undeniable lesson they had just witnessed. Elias Carter accepted the bottle without ceremony and began pouring fresh glasses along the bar for those who wanted them. His movements were steady, patient, unchanged. To anyone who had walked in at that moment, it would have looked like an ordinary evening in a frontier saloon. Yet the people who had watched the coin vanish from the counter knew the room had shifted in a way that would not easily return to what it had been before. Dalton picked up his glass and raised it slightly toward Elias. "To quiet men with fast hands," he said. Several others in the room lifted their glasses as well, though a few townsfolk exchanged glances that suggested they were beginning to piece together something much larger. In the corner, the old rancher finally stood up from his chair. The movement drew a few curious looks, but he simply adjusted his hat and walked slowly toward the bar. When he reached it, he placed both hands on the counter and looked at Elias with the kind of calm respect earned only through long years of experience. "I thought I recognized the way you moved," the rancher said quietly. Dalton turned his head toward him with interest. "Recognized?" he asked. The rancher nodded once. "Years ago," he continued, "there was a man riding across this part of the country who could outdraw almost anyone on the frontier. Folks said he was faster than a striking rattlesnake and calmer than a winter sunrise." Several men around the room leaned in slightly as the rancher spoke. Dalton raised one eyebrow and looked back toward Elias. "That sounds like quite a reputation," he said. The rancher smiled faintly beneath the brim of his hat. "It was," he replied. Then he glanced at the bartender again and added in a quieter voice, "Name was Elias Carter." The room fell silent once more. Dalton's eyes widened slightly as the pieces finally came together. He looked at the bartender with renewed understanding. But Elias Carter simply finished pouring the last glass and placed the bottle back on the shelf. He did not deny the story. He did not confirm it either. Instead, he wiped the counter with the same calm cloth and spoke in a voice so steady it carried across the entire saloon without effort. "That was a long time ago." The rancher nodded slowly. "Yes," he said, "it was." And for the first time since Dalton and his men had entered the Broken Spur Saloon, every man in the room understood that the quiet bartender standing behind the bar had once walked a very different road across the wide and restless West. For a long moment after the rancher spoke the name, no one inside the Broken Spur Saloon said a single word. The air felt heavier, like the quiet after thunder rolls across distant hills. Wade Dalton stood very still, his glass resting in his hand while his eyes stayed fixed on the man behind the bar. The name Elias Carter had traveled across the frontier years before like a story carried by dry wind. Some men said he had been the fastest draw from Kansas to the Rio Grande. Others said he had walked away from that life without explanation, leaving behind only rumors and unfinished legends. Dalton slowly set his glass down on the counter. "Well," he said quietly, "that explains a few things." His men looked at one another, their earlier confidence now replaced by the cautious respect that frontier riders learned to show when they realized they had stepped into deeper waters than expected. The man who liked to spin coins gave a small nod toward Elias. "You kept that quiet," he said. Elias Carter continued wiping the bar as if the conversation belonged to someone else. His cloth moved slowly across the polished wood, erasing a faint ring left behind by a whiskey glass. "A man can live many lives," he said calmly. "Some of them are better left behind." The rancher leaned lightly against the counter and studied him with a thoughtful look. "You did not leave because you were slow?" the old man said. Elias shook his head slightly. "No," he replied. "I left because I was tired." Dalton gave a soft laugh. At that, though it carried none of the mockery it once had. "Tired of winning?" he asked. Elias finally looked up, meeting Dalton's eyes across the bar. "Tired of what winning costs," he answered. The words settled over the room in a quiet wave of understanding. Men who had spent years on cattle drives and dusty trails knew exactly what he meant. Dalton picked up his hat from the bar and turned it slowly in his hands. "You know," he said after a moment. Most men would not walk away from a reputation like that. Elias placed the cloth down beside the bottles and straightened the row of glasses behind him. The lamplight caught the polished surfaces and reflected across the bar like a calm line of sunset. "Peace is worth more than reputation," he said. Dalton studied him one last time before placing his hat back on his head. Then he nodded once, the gesture small but sincere. "Fair enough," he said. He turned toward the door and motioned for his men to follow. The outlaws moved quietly now, their boots softer against the wooden floor than when they had first entered. As Dalton reached the doorway, he paused and glanced back toward the bar. "You run a good saloon," he said. Elias gave a small nod in return. Dalton stepped out into the fading light of the street, his men following behind him until the door swung closed again with a gentle thud. The room remained silent for several seconds. Then the piano player slowly placed his fingers on the keys and began to play again, the soft notes filling the saloon like a calm breeze after a long storm. The rancher picked up his hat and gave Elias a respectful nod before heading toward the door as well. Soon the saloon returned to its familiar rhythm. Glasses clinked. Cards shuffled. Voices rose in quiet conversation. Behind the bar, Elias Carter continued polishing glasses just as he had before the outlaws arrived. To anyone passing through Red Hollow that evening, he would appear to be nothing more than a quiet bartender doing his job. But the men who had been inside the Broken Spur Saloon that day knew something different. Out on the frontier, the fastest hand in the West had not disappeared. He had simply chosen a quieter way to live.